Hello, everyone, and welcome to this introduction to this week's Listening to America podcast. I'm on Route 66 now, just about to enter the panhandle of Texas. I'll be going to Amarillo later today, and then things get a little complicated because I have some speaking engagements around the country. I'll park my Airstream at a friend's place in Amarillo. Phase 3 began a couple of weeks ago now. I left Bismarck, North Dakota, and drove to Vail, where I did some work for the Vail Symposium, then on to Arches and Canyonlands National Parks in Utah. Amazing. I went to Arches for the first time, 35 years ago, and I haven't been to Canyonlands since 1985 or so. Canyonlands is one of the greatest of our national parks. Arches is magnificent. Like all the other national parks, it's being loved to death, and in fact we had to have a reserved entrance time to go into the park. It's autumn, however, and the sense of chaos and hyper visitation of the national parks is no longer the same thing it would be in July. The school children are home, the family vacations are over. It's mostly senior citizens now who have the leisure to make autumn trips through the great universe of America's national parks, and foreigners. There's something amazing about how people from Europe and Asia love to come into the American West. I'm sure they love New York City, but maybe New Orleans, maybe Los Angeles or Seattle or San Francisco. But what they love to do especially is to visit Yellowstone and Yosemite and Crater Lake and Glacier and so on. I have never been in a national park when I didn't hear foreign voices. So when Ken Burns says that the national parks are America's greatest idea, I'm not certain that that's true, but it's one of America's greatest inventions. And our national park system is the envy of the world. And, I thought about this when I drove through Monument Valley after the time I spent in Arches and Canyonlands with friends, including an archaeologist who knows something about the world we were seeing. After the time I spent in Arches and Canyonlands, I drove down to Winslow, Arizona, to pick up Route 66, and really that was the formal beginning of Phase 3 of this journey. And on the way, I sort of inevitably passed through Monument Valley. It's amazing when you get to Mexican Hat and you see the great spires of Monument Valley for the first time. It takes your breath away. And there are probably a dozen scenic turnoffs where you can park your truck or your rig and take photographs or just gaze at Monument Valley, so iconic in the genre of Western films, for example. John Ford country, John Wayne country. And I thought, well, if you were creating a portfolio of like the 10 most iconic photographs of America, of course you would have to have the Statue of Liberty and the skyline of Manhattan. You would want to have Yellowstone, Old Faithful, or Yosemite. Of course, you would have a photograph, inevitably, of the Grand Canyon. But Monument Valley would certainly be in the top 10. And when you think of how the rest of the world sees us, they don't see Omaha. They don't see Shreveport, Louisiana. They don't see Austin, Texas. They see those icons of America, and they want to visit them, and so do we. I went to La Posada, the famous hotel, and I couldn't stay and I couldn't eat, but I did have a non-alcoholic drink at the Turquoise Bar. And then it was back on Route 66, much of it on Interstate 40, because Route 66 is not always accessible. Some of it's been absorbed. There are dead ends and all sorts of places where you just can't really take an Airstream trailer. So now I'm about to go to Amarillo and park the rig for a couple of weeks to do these other things that I must do. Although they're Listening to America journeys, they just aren't with the Airstream. So Russ and I talked about all that, but he's a Steinbeck expert, and so it's a real pleasure to be able to run my own ideas past him, because he is extremely well grounded in Steinbeck literature. Travels with Charley is not his favorite book. His favorite book is Cannery Row. My favorite Steinbeck book is The Grapes of Wrath, and this is a continuing discussion, argument, really, that Russ and I have in the best sense of the word argument. But we talked about what Steinbeck's purpose was, and one of the things I really want to emphasize as we continue is that I now know so much more about Steinbeck thanks to following in his tire tracks. I did not know when I began that he was not interested in the national parks. I had read that, of course. He had several passages in Travels with Charley in which he says this, but it didn't really register with me until I went to national parks that he could easily have visited, but he showed no interest whatsoever in that. I did not know before I started this journey that he rushed. I had a sense of it from my reading and from the book produced by the Dennis the Menace of Steinbeck Studies, Bill Steigerwald, that he was rushing around from Elaine Encounter to Elaine Encounter, his third wife. But I didn't really understand it till I got on the road myself and realized how fast he had to be moving to keep up the pace that he kept, and therefore how little he was able to stop and observe things. You have to keep moving. If you're going to go 11,500 miles, as he did in under 3 months, you're going to be moving all the time, really. So that was another insight that came from recreating the journey. I also have found that it's quite difficult to get into discussions with people about America, because you don't just walk up to somebody in a breakfast nook somewhere, at a counter at a Denny's or its equivalent, or some roadside stand, and say, "So, what do you think about America as we approach our 250th birthday?" That's the question I want to ask, but you don't just do it that way. I don't believe what his sons John and Tom said, that he probably was too shy to encounter anybody out there, or very few people. I think that's a jaded statement by disillusioned children. But I do think that he could not have had many real conversations because of the nature of the trip. He simply was moving too fast. And he said that when he tried to get people to talk about the national political situation, it was the election year 1960, Nixon v. Kennedy, people usually clammed up. They were willing to talk sports, but they really didn't want to talk about national politics. And I have found this to be the case. I've also found that it's not that easy to get a real conversation started, and when you do, you sometimes regret it. At any rate, I'm now well into phase 2. When I get done with this little interlude, I will then go on to New Orleans. I'm going to do a civil rights tour of Alabama and Mississippi. I wind up in North Carolina just before Thanksgiving, where I'll park the rig for the winter and then sprint home in my pickup in time for Thanksgiving, my favorite American holiday. So I'm having the time of my life. You can hear a little bit of edge in my throat. I picked up some strep throat when I was in England, and I've been sort of fighting it off ever since. The mornings are cool, sometimes even chilly in my rig. Fortunately, the gas heater is outstanding. Then it gets up to 85 or even 90 degrees in mid-afternoon. The light is beginning to disappear. It's dark when I get up in the morning now, and since I don't watch any television, I go to sleep earlier than ever because I read for a while, but if you read in bed, you know what happens. Anyway, it's a great experience. It's changed my life. I'll be doing a lot of writing about it over the winter. And of course, next year, year 2, Lewis and Clark, from Monticello all the way to Astoria and back again. We'll see you down the road. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. This is Russ Eagle. I'm back as your guest host as we once again try to catch up with Clay on the road. I can honestly say I have no idea where he is, but I do know he's on the third and final leg of his trip in Steinbeck's footsteps, or Steinbeck's tire tracks, I should say. And as I welcome you to the show this week, Clay, I have to point out that you've made some excursions recently that took you far off the Steinbeck Trail.
True enough, Russ. So I'm in phase 3 now. I'm actually in Tucumcari, New Mexico, which is in eastern New Mexico on Route 66. And tomorrow I go to Amarillo. Phase 3 began in Arches National Park and Canyonlands National Park, neither of which were on Steinbeck's radar. You know, one of the things that I really found fascinating, Russ, is how little interest he had in the national parks. He visited just one, Yellowstone, briefly, because Charley went nuts over sighting bears through the window of the cab. He also went to the Little Bighorn, which is a national monument, but only briefly. And he didn't go to Pinnacles, which is in his old stomping grounds in California. He didn't go to Zion or Bryce. He didn't go to the Grand Canyon. I would never have known this. You know, it's the kind of thing that's obvious the minute you see it, but you never saw it because you never thought about it. I've read Travels with Charley probably 20 times in the course of my life and studied it too. And I never thought about this until I was out here. And then I realized what an interesting, I won't say bad thing it is, but what an interesting thing it is that Steinbeck was not interested in the national parks. And he actually says during the Yellowstone interlude, as you know, he says, well, the greatest waterfall. He said, I'd rather look at a Matthew Brady photograph than Mount Rushmore. What do you make of this, that he was so indifferent to what Ken Burns has called America's greatest idea?
You know, I don't know because, you know, as you and I both know, there are really, I mean, you can drive all day in some of the national parks. I mean, there's more to them than just this or that mountain or waterfall. You know, one possible thing, you know, Steinbeck lived and grew up in an absolutely amazing place. You said Pinnacles, which is now a national park, and, you know, the Big Sur coastline, Point Lobos, which I can't remember the poet's name, but one poet called it the greatest meeting of land and water in the world. I think Robert Louis Stevenson was inspired, at least in terms of topography, for Treasure Island by his visits to Point Lobos, and we've been there many times. So
Point Lobos is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life, and there was a funeral service for Steinbeck there. It should have been a national park. It's not, but it's very well preserved on the Monterey Peninsula, and as you say, Pinnacles, but it's just a quirk. And so you think, okay, if Steinbeck wasn't interested in the national parks, or state parks for that matter. Remember what he says about Niagara Falls. Well, I only went so that no one would criticize me. Right. He says the same of Yellowstone. If he's not interested in that, he has about 24 encounters with people, and we've talked about some of those encounters, the Canucks up on the Maine border, and the itinerant Shakespearean actor, and the closeted gay young man in Idaho, and so on. Well, what was he interested in? And I don't mean that as a negative statement, but he says he wants to get back in touch with the voice and the character of the American people. What's he seeking, do you think, when he's kind of rushing around in the way that he did?
I don't know. You know, he talked about the things that did seem to have local flavor to him. One of them was the radio stations that he learned. He enjoyed listening to local radio as he drove through places. And, you know, he talked about breakfast was always the meal where you could meet people. But then he also pointed out that the conversation was the same everywhere. You know, coffee. Yep. Nope.
2 eggs up or over easy.
So I don't know, you know, and I think he found out something that maybe you're finding out, that you don't have a lot of spare time if you make that drive in that time frame.
He was pushing hard, I think, and the roads were no good at the time compared to today, and there were no RV parks, and you know, it was a different era, and he didn't have power steering, and he didn't have reclinable seats or back support and so on. So it must have been exhausting in a way that it is not in the 21st century. And by the way, it's plenty exhausting even now.
Right.
You know, I'm not trying to in any way criticize Steinbeck. What I'm really trying to figure out is what he did, what he intended to do, what worked and what didn't. And as you know, his sons both said, oh, he didn't, as far as we know, he didn't really talk to anybody. And you have to really always take what his sons say about him with a grain of salt, because there was a lot of tension in that family, to put it lightly.
Right. But, you know, I think he was looking for regional variety. You know, he talked about speech. He talked about customs in different places. What was different? What was the same? You know, I mean, I know he was hung up on the fact that nobody wanted to talk politics anywhere, but that was also, he was on the road during the great Yankees Pirates World Series, the famous Bill Mazeroski Game 7 home run. And he said you could always get an argument going if you want to talk about the Pirates and the Yankees, but if you want to talk about the election, nothing. And he does say, you know, when he gets to Louisiana, you know, that in a sense, that was the most unpleasant experience down in New Orleans of the whole trip. But, you know, that is where he did find people that were willing to to voice an opinion, regardless of how obscene it was.
He gets to Monterey, his old homeland. He confirms Thomas Wolfe's view that you can't go home again. But we sort of knew that was coming, didn't we? Then he's turning around to go back. He has to go all the way back across the country. And he says, I've run out of juice. I'm overstimulated. The Petri dish is full. I'm not taking much in anymore. And then he says, there are only two more things I want to do. I want to see Texas, and I want to get into the Deep South. And he did both.
Right.
But, in Texas, he mostly talks about the Thanksgiving up in the Panhandle, and then he just rockets across Texas, not much more commentary on Texas. And then we all know about the famous catastrophe of his time in New Orleans. And as you say, that's when he really does record what we take to be authentic encounters with people, all of whom were roiled by the civil rights movement in one way or another.
Yes, and there's plenty of video evidence available. He was telling the truth about what he saw, the whole Ruby Bridges thing. As far as Texas goes, I think that was mostly Steinbeck having fun with his in-laws. Not only the experience, but the sort of jabs he takes at Texas in his prose. As he said, he was wived and in-lawed and aunted and uncled within an inch of his life when he was in Texas. So.
Calls it an orgy, and if I were those hosts, I'd be a little miffed when the book comes out.
They were also very rich relatives, so...
They probably didn't care. So a couple of quick things. I know we're going to move on to other subjects, but number one, there's a certain lark element of doing what he did and doing what I'm doing. It's a feat in some ways, F-E-A-T. It's like, okay, you drive around the entire country and you find places to sleep and you have conversations here and there and you look at the landscape and you see local customs and local billboards and local radio and I pick up local newspapers and so on. So there's a certain kind of, it's a joyride of a certain sort. It's an enormously privileged thing to be able to do. As a boy, I feel every time I fill up the gas tank. The second thing about it is that his purposes are mysterious to me, Russ, because I'll just give you what I've done in the last couple of days. So I go to Vail for one of my Vail things. I was interviewing David Gregory, formerly of Meet the Press, but that was not part of this tour. Then I went to Arches National Park, because I'm working on Edward Abbey for a winter retreat, and Canyonlands National Park, where three of us hiked out all the way to the confluence of the Green and Colorado River, which is one of the greatest hikes. And then I went to Moab and interviewed an old friend of Edward Abbey's, which turned out to be fantastic. And then I went to Monument Valley and stopped to take photographs and so on. On any given day, there's something extraordinary that I want to divert to go look at and to take in, because I think, well, will I ever be back on this route? I'm on Route 66 tonight. I've traveled along it as much as is reasonably possible. I stopped in Winslow and, of course, had the obligatory photo taken on the corner and stopped at the Posada, the famous La Posada Hotel, and had a non-alcoholic drink. It's easy, is my point, to see great things. And I'm probably only seeing 1 in 100, but there's no day where there isn't something remarkable for me to go see and drink in and write about. So it was the same for him, more or less. So that can't have been his purpose. His purpose was something else than seeing really extraordinary places across the American landscape.
Well, I think his purpose all along was to prove to himself he could do it. His health was failing. If you look at the photos from 1960, there are some at the Steinbeck Research Center at San Jose showing Rocinante off to his neighbors. Steinbeck was a big man, a big barrel-chested man, and he doesn't look the same. He's thin. We're pretty sure that he had a couple of small strokes by that time. He wasn't happy with his professional career either. Amazingly, he was about to win the Nobel Prize, but his reputation was sort of in the dumps at the time. And as he said to his agent, it's one last desperate attempt to live.
You and I have both read some of that correspondence. So Elizabeth Otis was his agent, and she says, why don't you just take the bus and go on short trips? And his wife was worried about him. His friends were all concerned that, I don't think they thought he might not survive the trip, but I think they thought his health might break and then he'd be in the middle of nowhere, and who would be there to look out for him? Eventually, Charley, the dog, comes along in some sense as a chaperone for him. So there's that. And if you think about how hard travel was then in a pick up without proper cushioning and so on. At the end of the day, he's going to be really exhausted if his health isn't great. And you remember how many times in the book he says, I just wanted a bath. I got a motel that night because I just wanted a bath.
Right. I mean, I think that's the answer to your question. This was under the guise of getting to know America again, but this was proving something to himself about his virility, his manhood, his ability to live independently. He had become dependent on his wife. At that point, he was a rich man. And, he didn't live an ostentatious life, but, he did enjoy, as all of us would if we were in his situation, I'm sure. I'm not casting stones, but...
Me either. But do you think from that point of view, if you're right that he was basically trying to prove that he was still a man, and he made the trip of 11,500 miles, and there were no catastrophes, he had a flat tire, from that point of view, was the trip a success?
He never wrote about it besides the book. I know you talked with the great Steinbeck scholar Robert DeMott earlier on your trip, and he's the expert on this, and he said there's no journal with Travels with Charley. We really don't know much, and in his letters, all he really talks about is the trouble he's having coming up with a plan to turn this into an interesting story. I mean, he if you look at his letters, he struggled with this book about as much as any that he ever wrote. All right, Clay, we need to take a break, but when we come back, I know you haven't limited your travels to America in the recent weeks, so maybe you'll fill us in on what happened over in England recently.
Sounds good.
This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Listening to America. We're talking to Clay Jenkinson, who's on the road in the Listening to America Airstream. Tonight he's making his way to Amarillo, Texas. But just a couple weeks ago, Clay, you posted a picture, and I think you were in a cab approaching Big Ben in London.
I lead these cultural tours around the country, and every year I take one to Europe. So last year was France, this year was England, next year is France again, and then Italy. And I love those. They're about 10 days. And so people are interested, they should go to the site ltamerica.org. This was a 10-day literary tour of England, and so we were looking at Shakespeare, and we saw 2 Shakespeare plays, one at the Globe, the reconstructed Globe in London, and another a ballet of Romeo and Juliet in Stratford. We went to Oxford, where we got a marvelous insider's tour by my daughter, Catherine Missouri, who's now a research fellow and a postdoc, having finished her doctorate, her D.Phil, at Oxford. She's now at Pembroke College, which was the college of Samuel Johnson, the great writer of the English dictionary. We had an incredible experience, and we had 20 people. And we had an outfitter that provided the bus and booked rooms for us and meals and so on. And it was, for me, Russ, it was like a return. So I spent 4 years in England when I was a young man. And I love England more than any other place except America. And my first loves were literature, John Donne, later Shakespeare, John Milton, and the Romantic poets, Keats, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Blake, and so on. And so this was a chance for me to return to the source of my first great intellectual satisfactions. And we had a wonderful group of people. We toured around. We had discussions of, I built a reader that people, could look at before we went. We went over some of the passages during our leisure times, but we were in England at a time when it didn't rain much. The temperatures were perfect. All the logistics held up well. And so people got a real sample of the literature and the land of England, and it made me very happy. But the happiest part of it was to be co-hosting with my daughter Catherine. And so she's now 30. Her manuscript on the Tower of London is being considered, at least by Oxford University Press, for publication as a monograph. This is a fabulous time in her life. She's in a steady and very satisfying relationship with a young Swiss man, and I think they're heading towards a life together. And to be able to share it with her and to watch people enjoy her, because she, as you know, she's a really fabulous presenter, passionate, often makes fun of her father. There's a lot of humor, and people really listened very carefully, and especially when we went to the Tower of London, which was the subject of her doctoral dissertation. And so people, I have to admit this, people are not going to say, oh, that Clay Jenkinson. They're going to say, oh, that Clay Jenkinson's daughter, Catherine. First, she showed us the Tower of London and gave a beautiful introduction there. And then she showed us the insider's tour of Oxford University. And so I couldn't, as a proud father, I know you are one too, I couldn't have been more purely delighted than by that. We saw The Taming of the Shrew, and then we went to Stratford-on-Avon, and we wanted to see a second Shakespeare play, but the only thing we could see, given the schedule we were on, was a ballet of Romeo and Juliet. And when this first came to my attention, I sort of groaned a little, because I really wanted to see the play, but it was unbelievably beautiful. I mean, it was the kind of thing where you nearly weep for the beauty of human motion when it's done with all of its grace and poetry. It was stunning. So it was really a successful Shakespearean excursion in England.
Well, I have a daughter and a granddaughter who many times in their life live for ballet, so I know the Nutcracker backwards and forwards.
Of course, we all know that one, don't we?
And where was the restaurant you said you ate
It's
after?
the Dirty Duck, it's called. It's right there across from the theater.
What does one order at the Dirty Duck?
Well, you can order lots of things, but this was a set meal, and I believe that it was beef, but we had lots of steak and kidney pies in the course of our time. We had some plowman's lunches. We had fish and chips, of course. We had some stews. If you're rich and have a lot of time at the Dirty Duck, you can order anything in the world. Britain is not famous for its cuisine, although the food was remarkably good wherever we went.
And you mentioned the pub life, too, in the essay that you wrote.
Yeah, pub life is great.
And I think part of your motivation for going to England at this time, just like going to Utah at this time, was you have winter encampments, as you call them, coming up in January on Edward Abbey and on Shakespeare.
There are two this year. One is on Henry David Thoreau's Walden and Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire. I'll come back to that. That one is first, and the second one is January 12th through 17th, just west of Missoula. That's where you would fly. And it's on two Shakespeare plays, his comedy As You Like It, which is his happiest comedy, and then one of the greatest of the tragedies, King Lear. And we also read Bill Bryson's short book on Shakespeare, which is an excellent introduction to that subject. And one of the purposes of the Shakespeare retreat, Russ, is to help people get over the intimidation hump with Shakespeare, because so many people say, I can't understand a word, or I had a bad experience in high school, or it's just too much. But I think there are ways to teach Shakespeare that get you over those humps pretty well, and there's some great books like No Fear Shakespeare and great websites, and the films based on Shakespearean plays are now world class. So we'll do some of that media with it too, and then we'll talk about the sort of the intellectual revolution that was occurring during Shakespeare's time. But also, King Lear is about, in a sense, it's about Alzheimer's. It's about what happens when an old man loses his mental faculties and his children have to figure out how to deal with his irascible temper and his irrational decision making and so on. And of course, whenever there's a situation like this, the sibling rivalries can become toxic, as we all know.
Right. And
then As You Like It, among other things, is about, I suppose, what we would call transgender. So all the actors were boys. The lead is a woman named Rosalind, played by a boy. She goes to the woods to escape tyranny and takes on the clothing of a boy. So boy actor playing a woman, now pretending to be a boy. And then she winds up teaching a young man how to court women by pretending to be a woman. So boy actor, woman lead, pretends to be a boy in the woods, pretends to be a girl in the woods. And so Shakespeare's on to the whole question of gender construction that is kind of really roiling our own time and place. And so it makes it for some very interesting conversation. And I'm told that there are a couple of places, a couple of people had to withdraw. So there are a couple of empty places on the Shakespeare retreat, the encampment, and that's the 12th through the 17th of January. So if people are interested, they can go to the website, LT America, and it's all there.
Right, I think that's there. There's the trip on Cuba, the trip to Cuba in late February and early March is up now, I think.
People have been badgering us for the last 5 or 6 years. When can we go to Cuba? When can we go back to Cuba? Well, now we're going on the 23rd of February through March 6th. I've only been once, but our outfitter, a good friend of yours and mine, Wayne Fairchild, has been now 20 times. He loves it. He's superb at it. He has local coordinators who serve as liaisons to that culture. Of all the trips I've ever taken, the two that are life-changing are the Lewis and Clark trip, which you've been on 9 times now, sometimes as a participant and now as management, and the Cuba trip, which was one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. We drive across the entire 700-mile island, and you see people plowing with oxen, and you realize 90 miles from Florida, 90 miles from one of the richest places on earth, is this sort of second/third world country that we've had our boot on now for 60 years. And that's good news and bad news. Bad news for them, but it's kind of wonderful to see a pre-Costco world, and it's enchanting. And if anyone is interested, this is the way to do it. Wayne is outstanding at being he's there the whole time, of course, and then I'm the presenter. So I talk about Castro and the revolution. We talk about Hemingway, and we go to Hemingway's villa near Havana. We also get into the old cars that are such a specialty on the streets of Havana. We go to the Bay of Pigs, which of course is famous debacle early on in the Kennedy administration. In fact, if he hadn't failed at the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy might not have embraced the space program. He was looking for something to redeem his already troubled presidency. And so we swam in the Bay of Pigs last time. We're going to stay there overnight. We also get close to Guantanamo. We talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We talk about Che Guevara and Castro. One of the fun facts of this is that Castro was once the darling of the American establishment. He was on the Ed Sullivan Show before he nationalized Cuban industries and drove us into hostility. So we have a number of places left on the Cuba trip from the 23rd of February to March 6th. So if you've ever wanted to go to Cuba and kind of how would I do that, this is the trip to take. And then the Shakespeare is the 12th through the 17th of January. There's my little Hamiltonian moment. I'm sorry.
Well, you mentioned our friend Wayne, and you also mentioned the summer trip. Wayne is involved in efforts now to clean up the Wendover Trail. We just missed by about 48 hours being in some real trouble last year.
We could have been up on the ridge, and just imagine if that had happened when you have like all the tents set up and the tables in the kitchen. But you and I had one of the really remarkable experiences of our long friendship, because we were leaving Fort Benton to go to Missoula and beyond, and we got a text from Wayne saying, "Come over immediately." So we went to his house in Missoula, and I'll never forget it. He was sitting in the dark. He looked like all was lost. I've never seen him at a loss in my entire life, because his motto for everything is, "Yeah, on it," and he always finds a way. But he was really down when we saw him. He said, "I don't know if we're going to be able to do this trip," and it all worked out. But this giant wind shear had come through the Bitterroot Mountains and leveled tens of thousands of trees, destroyed campgrounds. It destroyed our trail, the Wendover Death March, up to the top. And Wayne couldn't get his crews with trucks and vans to take the gear to the top of the ridge. So we had to rebuild the trip in his darkened family room in Missoula, and it all turned out beautifully. But he has now offered to the U.S. Forest Service, the Clearwater National Forest, to help clear the Wendover Trail. And here's what's so interesting about that, Russ, is you know as well as I, if you wanted to go to one place in the Lewis and Clark world where you could really just like be in their footsteps, it's that hike. It's called Wendover after somebody who came much, much later. But Lewis was sure they were in the wrong place, and so he marched all of his people straight up the mountain. It's a very difficult day. It's exhausting. It's 7.5 miles. I think the altitude gain is 3,500 feet. So it's not the worst hike in the world, but it's a tough one. And I've done it 20 sometimes. You've done it 8 or 9 now. And I was really saddened that we couldn't do it this year. But Wayne believes that if he can get a grant from the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, which I edit their quarterly journal, if he can get a grant of about $10,000, he'll take his own people in there and clear it. And I talked to the head of the Clearwater National Forest Trails Division. She was amazing. She's a good friend of Wayne's. And she said that not just you and I couldn't go do this because we have to get trained and cleared on chainsaws and so on, but that Wayne's people are all certified, not to mention certifiable, and that if he got the grant, he said that he told me the other day that if he gets some money, he can certainly clear the last 3.5 miles, and maybe all of it by the time we get there in July next year. And if he doesn't do it, it's not likely to get done because it's not a popular hike. There are, as you know, we went on some other hikes because we couldn't go up Wendover, and they're very well positioned. The ascent's reasonable. They're well marked and well kept. Wendover not so much because our friend Chad, who's always there too, says truthfully that we take 20 people up every year. That's about half of all the people who go up on any given calendar year.
Right. And also, as we both know, that's a trail that needs considerable clearing even in a normal weather year. I mean, the fallen timber, the pine beetles and so forth. That's always what people want to talk about when they finally make it to the top is how many trees they had to climb over. But when we went this summer, I mean, you and I tried to go up the trail. We couldn't get more than 50, 75 feet. I mean, these are just massive trees just piled up on the trail.
4 of the last 5 summer trips that you and I have done together, 2 on the Salmon and the others, Lewis and Clark, on the Lolo Trail, we've had to change our plans because of fires and other climate exaggeration events that seem to be linked. Not to mention the Rocky Mountain pine beetle, which has devastated one of the 2 greatest campgrounds on top of the ridge that we just loved. But now those trees are all dead, and that's happened in 15 years.
Yes, and since you and I talked last, we in North Carolina have gotten our experience of fallen timber. It's amazing what's happened here.
Yeah, but I heard that FEMA's confiscating people's land. And I heard that the people, is this true? I heard this, we're recording this on the 14th of October. I heard that this is true, I'm not exaggerating this one, that militias have been intimidating FEMA workers because the far right has been saying that that FEMA's corrupt and that they're fraudulent, they're confiscating land and so on. I mean, it's just shocking that we could politicize a natural disaster of this magnitude.
Right. I have no doubt that that's true. And of course, while we're dealing with it, Florida gets hit again. So, FEMA's got enough on its hands without having to deal with it.
So, Russ, you and Liz have connections up in Asheville and so on. Were those properties damaged?
Yes. We have good friends in Asheville that we had planned to visit in October. And it was close to a week before we could they had no cell service, no nothing. So we couldn't even verify that they were okay. And they had more than 50 trees down just on their property and one through the roof. They're safe. But yeah, this was the first time I've ever watched, video of these floods and so forth and seen places underwater that I'm very familiar with, places that I've stood many times. It was frightening and bizarre.
As I came back from England, of course, I was aware of this, but then I realized it was in your neighborhood, and I texted you and said, are you okay? And I think you said that you and Liz stayed up deep into the night wondering if the trees on your own property would collapse.
Right. I mean, we were pretty lucky, but as I've told people, the worst thing we had was 3 or 4 pretty scary hours of watching the trees and plenty of trees fell, but, we try to keep trees cut back that can fall in the house the best you can. But you have to go about an hour west of us to get to where the real devastation started.
And that's deep inland, which nobody expects, right?
Right. But, I think it's the new norm.
Yeah. So again, what happened in the Bitterroots, this wind shear event that caught a fairly narrow swath, but a devastating one through the Lochsaw River Valley. Carol Hennessy says that the campgrounds won't be open, maybe not even next summer, that it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to clear the wood out, and then there has to be repair of fences and bathrooms and toilets and campsites and so on. So this is not a simple thing where the event happens and a month later things are back to normal. This is really a devastation. And so I'm really proud of our mutual friend Wayne, because he wants to step up. And I asked him to write about it. And I asked one of his workers, Keenan, to write about it. And so they'll be in the November issue of We Proceeded On, this Lewis and Clark Quarterly that I edit. And Keenan wrote something really beautiful, like that he's been at this for dozens of 20-some years, and that he has a personal relationship with this Wendover hike, and that it's shattering to his own sense of what he does to see this happen, and that this is so important that we must give it priority. But you can imagine, Russ, in a year like this, a little problem like that in the Bitterroot Mountains is not going to get a lot of national attention.
Right. You're right, Clay. We need to take another break. But when we come back, maybe we'll talk a little bit about Edward Abbey and maybe what he would think when he saw you pulling your Airstream and Arches.
Oh, we know what he would think about that. We'll take a short break. We'll see you all in just a minute. Welcome back, everyone, to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm with my dear friend Russ Eagle of North Carolina. Survived the wind events in Carolina. We're talking about all of the adventures of this year for me. It's been the year of Shakespeare, as I said. I went to see Macbeth in Ashland in Oregon. Then I saw Taming of the Shrew in Cedar City. Then I saw the ballet of Romeo and Juliet in Stratford, and I saw Taming of the Shrew in a very different production in London at the Globe. So there's been that, and I've had all of these strange and wonderful side trips and adventures. It's been extraordinary. When I finished phase 2, I took a few weeks off to go to England and to take care of some other things. There was a Theodore Roosevelt Symposium in Western North Dakota, and there was a symposium cultural tour that I was part of. And then I had to be in Vail for David Gregory, who turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful man. I didn't know what to expect. Former moderator of Meet the Press, known for his really sharp questioning of G.W. Bush. Turns out they were friends too. And then I decided, well, if I'm going back down to pick up Route 66, I'll be going through either western Colorado or eastern Utah. And since I'm doing this winter encampment on Edward Abbey and Henry David Thoreau, I thought, well, I'll go see Arches, because as you know, in 1956 and 1957, young Edward Abbey was a seasonal ranger at what was then Arches National Monument. It had dirt roads, and it was very primitive at the time, and he lived in a tiny little trailer about the size, well, a little bigger than my Airstream, but infinitely less luxurious. And he wound up writing a classic, kind of an update on Thoreau's Walden, grumpier, but fascinating. And Desert Solitaire is one of my favorite books, and so we've chosen that for the winter retreat. And I thought, well, maybe I should go, just as I've learned, Russ, by following Steinbeck's footprints, that I've learned an enormous amount about him that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't done this, which has really been a revelation. I'm amazed by that, frankly. I thought, well, maybe I better go see Edward Abbey's home court. I've been to Arches before, but it's been 30 years. I've been to Canyonlands, but it's been 30 years. And so I went, and my friend Dennis McKenna of Listening to America was there. My friend Susan Ryan, an archaeologist from Cortez, was there. And Frank, the scout, was there, although he didn't do the big hike out to the confluence. And it was great to be there. Timed entry into Arches. That's where we are, loving our national parks to death. But we saw all the things I wanted to see. I principally wanted to get to where the trailer was, and we found that site. Then Canyonlands, which he talks about, but not as Canyonlands. He really talks about it as just natural features, especially something called the maze. And that was an extraordinary experience. But maybe the highlight of that was that, thanks to Frank, we got an appointment with Ken Slate. Ken Slate is 95 now. He lives in Moab. He was one of Abbey's close friends, and he's trying to finish a book on Abbey. He granted us a morning of conversation, which I recorded, and I'll be using excerpts from that at the winter encampment. And then, thanks to Susan Ryan, I'm also going to meet Jack Leffler, who was another friend of Abbey's, and Abbey's fifth and last wife, Clark, her first name is Clark, lives nearby, and we're seeing if she will allow me to interview her. And so what's happened is that I used to just read Desert Solitaire, and I read maybe the Monkey Wrench Gang, his novel about destroying Glen Canyon Dam, but now I've read most of Abbey, and especially his journals, which are magnificent. In a sense, more interesting than Edward Abbey is himself. I see you're holding a copy of Confessions of a Barbarian, which, by the way, I'm glad you have it. It's not a really good title, because it kind of it gives you a sense of Abbey that's not really true. It's very earnest. I think you're reading it now, right? I mean, you're seeing how sensitive a person he really was behind that gruff exterior.
Yeah, you said something interesting in one of your essays. You said that nobody really brings enough to the table to grasp everything that's embedded in his work. You know, he's way more than the so-called prophet of rage.
Yes, but you ended segment 2 by saying, what would he think of me? Well, not at all, of course, but, you know, you can't read. He has a famous chapter in Desert Solitaire on industrial tourism. It just says these people who roll in their fancy vehicles and they're overweight and they're pampered and they're wearing their shorts and their Hawaiian print shirts, and they say, is there anything to see here, and how long does it take to see this park, and are the rattlesnakes going to be a problem? And he just hated industrial tourism, and of course that was then. Today, I mean, his sense of rage would be through the roof. You know, we're really truly loving the national parks to death. And how we're going to fix that, I don't know. But he has an 8-point plan to save the national parks from this book, which was published in 1968 and brought him national fame. And one of them is to simply ban all cars in national parks. You can go in on buses, you can bicycle in, you can hike in, you can take horses in, but you can't drive a car in. That's now true in a couple of the national parks, and it will certainly be true in more of them before this phenomenon ends. I think nobody could have anticipated how much Americans love to go to national parks. But Abbey's view was, well, they may go to national parks, but are they really experiencing them through closed air-conditioned cars, through stopping and getting ice cream? It's tourism the way tourism always works everywhere, with a lot of sort of semi-unhappy children and stops to get fuel and food. And, when you see a bear, I have cabins at Yellowstone, which you've been to, and Liz. When you see a bear in Yellowstone National Park, it causes a traffic jam of 250 cars. And so this is something he would just absolutely hate, and I think it's fair to say he would have a lot of pretty sarcastic criticism of someone like me. Russ, everywhere, you may have heard a dog in the background there for a minute. Everywhere I go, people say, well, why don't you have a dog? Charley, why don't you have a dog? And it's like people lose kind of respect for me in a certain way that I don't have a dog. And of course I resent it that you said I'm not responsible enough to have one, but that's another question. But I see dogs everywhere. Last night I camped at a place called Grant's, which is near Acoma, this magnificent Pueblo village, which is important to Edward Curtis. So that was another one of the highlights of my entire journey, going to Acoma, which is this mesa, which is sacred and off limits, and you have to go on a tour with a Pueblo guide, and there are prohibitions on photographs and so on. But it was just stunning and beautiful and moving and just kind of revolutionary. But I was staying at this campground, and next to me was this tiny little, I think it was called a snoozy, little yellow pole type trailer, not big enough for a tiny person. And 2 very large Americans were in it with a cat and a very large dog. And so you see the dogs everywhere, and the dogs are always sniffing around each other and getting into little fights. And people love their dogs, and I love dogs too. My mother was a great dog lover, and I would have a dog if I had a life. But I'm amazed at how many people equate RV life with having a dog, even if they've never heard of John Steinbeck.
I can walk out my front door and see several homes with RVs, and I know every time they hit the road, it's with their dog sitting up in the front seat. So yeah, it's a thing.
It's a thing, and I'm not criticizing it in any way. I think it's great. I would love to have a dog with me. I'd love to have a Charley, but one of the things I'm thinking about, Russ, is that, of course, Charley was a great dog. I mean, there's no question that Charley was a great dog. But Steinbeck is a great writer, and he writes about the dog in an incredibly enchanting way. If you took the dog out of Travels with Charley, we wouldn't probably be having this conversation. The book's fame is dependent upon Charley more than it is on John Steinbeck, I think, and that combination of sort of Don Quixote, Steinbeck, and Sancho Panza, Charley, and the communications, the nonverbal communications they have for 11,500 miles is the best of the book in many respects. And so that's a deficit in what I'm doing, because among other things, you walk around one of these campgrounds with a dog, you're going to have all the conversations you can possibly stand.
Right. In fact, anytime I'm walking anywhere, if Liz is with me, if I see a dog coming, I know I'm going to be held up 10 or 15 minutes. Well,
yeah, but you can say that of Liz, and we both, of course, love Liz. But I've seen you at Lochsaw Lodge get down on your hands and knees to greet a dog that you have a special love affair with there.
Oh yes, I'm very much a dog person, but I'm not as apt to approach strange dogs.
Liz makes friends everywhere. You and I belong. I'm in the middle. You're at the grumpy end of the human spectrum, but I'm not a person who's just, oh, may I pet your dog? I'm a little wary of approaching strange dogs.
Well, Liz was having conversations in France with dogs, and she doesn't speak French, so.
But she speaks the universal language of human joy, compassion, and friendliness, and that makes a huge difference.
All right, Clay, you've got 2 places remaining, Texas and Louisiana. You say you're on your way to Amarillo now. I hope you'll stop at the Big Texan Steakhouse and eat the 72-ounce steak.
So, I've been in touch with our mutual friend, Joe Lovell, and he's going to store my rig because I have to go to Chicago and I have to go to Birmingham, and it gets a little chaotic here for a time because these were performance and lecture dates that were set long before this crazy scheme. And so he's going to store the rig at a friend's house for about 2.5 weeks. But he did say in a communication yesterday, it's either now, tomorrow night, or when I get back that we're going to the Big Texas Steakhouse to see if I can manhandle one of the big ones. You've done this.
I've been to the steakhouse. I've never tried that. I mean, they put you up on a pedestal, a big platform, so everybody in the restaurant can see you with the clock behind you, and you don't just have to eat the 72-ounce steak. You have to eat a salad and a baked potato, and I can't imagine doing it.
There's no way that I would do it. I wouldn't want to be a spectacle, and I would definitely fail. I can't, at this point in my life, I can't eat a 24-ounce steak, although when I was 18, I might have been able to do that. I see the annual hot dog eating contest on television, and it makes me just want to throw up in the backyard to watch grown people putting 52 hot dogs in their buns, in their mouth, and somehow swallowing it all. I will go there, of course. It's a phenomenon. He said, and I think you would agree, that this is kind of a must-do kind of Texas experience. Filet or New York strip steak of about 10 ounces. But that's not the Texas way, is it? And then I want to, I'm coming back to do something at West Texas A&M in November. Then I'm going to come to New Orleans, and you're going to join me and Liz, the famous Liz, and she has promised me that I will have the first and best gumbo of my life under her direction in the city of New Orleans.
Right. And we talked about this the last podcast we did together, and listeners responded greatly with suggestions of where you needed to go in New Orleans.
Is it just in New Orleans, or did they say, no, you need to be in Mobile, or...
There was some of that, but...
So I think, Liz's credibility is really on the line here, because she is the nicest person who ever walked on earth, but she is a snob about gumbo. And whenever I say, oh, I had some good gumbo in St. Louis, or I had some good gumbo in Roanoke or Radford, Virginia, within seconds I get an angry response from her like, no, you didn't. You have not had gumbo yet. So I know that she's probably suffering from the pressure, the sheer anxiety of this thing.
Well, she's fairly well connected in the culinary world in New Orleans, so I think she's feeling pretty confident about it.
I'm looking forward to it.
I'm not a big gumbo eater, but it is, they do bring it to a new level in New Orleans. And another thing, when you order, you better not order a virgin Bloody Mary when you get to New Orleans. They may run you out of town.
Well, I only did that at the La Posada in Winslow because I had 200 miles to drive. And I think what's worse than my driving an RV? Driving it while intoxicated. So I didn't, and I got a lot of abuse for that from people saying, "Oh, come on, what kind of you're no real man. You should have had 4 of them." So yes, but this is not a food tour. So many of them are. Steinbeck was interested in food in 2 ways. He wanted to see regional cuisine, but he also was worried about the plasticization and homogenization of American food, the coming of fast food and food in cellophanes and automats for food and so on. And he was pretty disappointed by the loss of what he would have taken to be regional, authentic cookery.
He was, but he was also, as he says in the book, he was familiar with the great restaurants of New Orleans, Antoine's and Galatoire's. And
I'm hoping to encounter Ruby Bridges. She's still alive. She's the young black girl at the time who was in the famous painting by Norman Rockwell and was the subject of the abuse that he witnessed by the so-called cheerleaders, these white, racist, angry women, when he went there towards the end of his journey. And as you know, he was so profoundly appalled and saddened by what he saw that day that he hastened home. He really just rocketed as fast as his truck camper could get him back to New York City.
Yes, and I've been to the school, but I have never met her. I don't know where she works out of now.
I'm looking for her, but I know that she's still there, and there's a website and so on, and so I'm trying to set that up. And then I know you're going to try to join me for a little of it, at least. I want to do a civil rights tour of Alabama and Mississippi. I want to go to the Pettus Bridge, of course. I want to go to Birmingham. I want to go to Montgomery. I don't know if there'll be time to go down to Biloxi, but that's where Jefferson Davis's Belvoir was. I've been there once before. But since Steinbeck, in a sense, was so offended by what he saw, so really damaged and hurt by what he saw, so disappointed in this aspect of American life in 1960, just as the civil rights movement was heating up, that he lost interest in the rest of the trip, and so he basically gave up at that point. I'm going to do the civil rights tour of those states because I think that's sort of compensatory, a better way to look at this. And I'm hoping, Russ, to get into conversations with 4 or 5 or 6 individuals along the lines of Steinbeck's encounters there, and asking people, both white and black, how are things now? I mean, what's the racial tension here? Are we moving forward towards greater enlightenment, or are we in a retrograde motion? Questions like that. I think these are the questions he wanted to ask, and he was pretty disappointed with the answers that he got.
It will be interesting. I guess we will be in New Orleans just after the election, so
that'll make it even. Well, but that's not our subject. But Steinbeck did make sure he saw all 3 of the presidential debates in 1960 between Nixon and John Kennedy, and that would not have been easy. It'd be easy for us to watch them, but it was difficult. And one of them he watched in Livingston, Montana, but he made sure to observe them. And he became a Kennedy man. He was really an Adlai Stevenson man, but he became a Kennedy man. And then, as you know, I'm working on a whole saga about his relationship with Jacqueline Kennedy and his plan to translate the medieval text, the Morte d'Arthur, but that's another question for another time. I'm having the greatest time you can possibly imagine out here, Russ, and I can't wait to see you and Liz and to really test the gumbo promise in New Orleans. And then we will be at Lochsa, and one of them is completely full. That's Edward Abbey and Henry David Thoreau. And the other one, the Shakespeare one, now has a couple of places, and I urge people to come. I think you can attest that people's concern is, won't there be awful weather? But no, it's usually balmy, wonderful. It's snow. It snows almost every day, but it's not cold.
And in Montana, in the Bitterroot Mountains, they know how to deal with snow. I mean, 30 inches of snow doesn't even slow them down. So I think this will be my 12th straight January at Lochsa Lodge. And I know it's yours too. So.
And you usually bring some music. I'll be sending you some suggestions about music we can play between sessions. But we meet for about 6 hours a day, 5. There's plenty of downtime. There's a lot of just conviviality. We do group dinners and individual dinners. There's breakfast every day. There are some hikes. At the end, we go to the hot springs, Jerry Johnson Hot Springs, which is one of the supreme pleasures of life. This is the book club you always wanted to be part of, and it's been going on now for, I suppose, almost 20 years, and it's one of the highlights of my year, and I know you and Liz are central players in all of that too, so we'll look forward to that. But I've got miles to go before that happens, and any number of things can go wrong.
Well, I'm going to be in New Orleans waiting for you, and hopefully you will get there. We're out of time now, Clay, so we'll track your whereabouts on the LTA website, on your social media, and I know you will be back next week with another edition of Listening to America.
We'll see you all then, and thanks to my friend Russ Eagle for being the host on programs related to Travels with Charley and John Steinbeck. We'll see you all next week.